Thank you. I know we're standing between the fourth quarter and cocktails, so we'll try and keep it entertaining for you guys. I guess I'd love the team to just, I know they got a brief background and kind of like where you are in your career, kind of your very quick evolution through management, and then we'll jump into some questions.
Hey, I'm Joe Binney. I lead the product engineering team and the product management team at Robinhood. I joined Robinhood about 4 years ago when it was about 10 people, and now it's about 100 people. I joined as the first product engineer myself and grew into a management role as the company grew.
Hi everyone, my name is Raylene. I lead the applications team or group at Stripe. So the applications group builds basically our full stack products. So if you're familiar with Stripe, it's everything from Atlas, our product for entrepreneurs, to Connect, which powers platforms and marketplaces, to Sigma, which is kind of a new product that's focused on reporting. I joined Stripe about 2 years ago and have seen Stripe grow from 200 employees to just around 800. And prior to Stripe, I was an engineering director at Facebook. And I saw Facebook grow from around 200 engineers to like 3,000 to 4,000 engineers and over 10,000 employees. So I've seen a lot of kind of different phases of growth and really enjoyed kind of being both an IC tech lead and engineering manager and director at various stages.
Lee Edwards. So my first job was at iRobot, and I managed 2 interns. That was probably the first time I did some management. My next job was at Pivotal Labs, which was also a very large company that had no engineering managers whatsoever, at least while I was there. And then joined a company called SideTour as the first engineer, lead engineer. And so once we raised money, we hired a team of 4 people. We were acquired by Groupon, joined Groupon as an engineering manager, managed all the engineers in New York, and then joined Teespring engineering, managed 3 teams and a few managers, and then moved into a VP engineering role, and then recently CTO, which is doing basically the same thing, but I think those 2 titles are pretty portable at different companies, but yeah.
All right, well, great. So it's actually, I think 2 Facebook peoples. I worked with Shrep at Mozilla, and then I built an HR product. I think all of you guys have used at one point, because like Facebook was a customer, Pivotal was a customer, like early Ripple days. So it's kind of funny, like watching all this together. So how much was moving into management a push or a pull thing? Meaning like, did someone say like, hey, you're now in charge of managing these people, or was it something that you were seeking out?
I think it was a little bit of both. So I think, well, actually at iRobot, when I managed the interns, that was 100% push. I did not want to do that. But I think, when I joined SideTour, that was kind of my first time managing a team of 4 people. And we kind of knew that if we saw any success and we raised more money and we had budget and we had enough of a roadmap, we'd hire engineers and I'd have to manage them. And I went in kind of knowing that was a possibility and it was something I wanted to do, but I only kind of got the opportunity to do it after a certain period of time. And then after that, I really liked it, so I've really only done management jobs since then.
It's sort of similar. I think it's always a bit of a combination of both. Just in the earlier talk, I liked how he covered kind of what are those baby steps to management, and very naturally started mentoring interns, training new hires, tech leading projects. But I would say the push, I guess, comes from the opportunity as well. So a big piece of switching into management is just, are there any management opportunities? Is your team growing? Do you need a new manager for that team? So at Facebook, a couple of years in, there was a new team forming, basically privacy, and at the time it was a good combination of wanting to try it and having that opportunity. One thing I was going to say earlier, I heard him talk about how you have to think about engineering management and as engineering IC roles as like different careers, and you kind of like make this conscious jump back. One thing I think that's really great about engineering though is I do think you can switch back pretty fluidly if you need to, and something that both Facebook and Stripe do really well, where firsthand I've worked with tech leads and ICs who have switched successfully back and forth between IC and management roles. And I think you get that by building a really strong technical base as an individual contributor. So I think that you can switch over, and there's a lot that goes into that, but you also shouldn't feel like you can't switch back and forth because your career is very long in many ways. I think the skills of engineering leadership are very interchangeable.
Yeah, and that's something I've seen a lot of people do at Facebook, actually. When I was joining Facebook, I saw some engineering directors who were getting re-brought through boot camp to become software IC engineers again. But yeah, it's kind of funny, Dan, that you mentioned working with Shrep, because actually this was a big part of my initial foundation in my interest in management. I started my career at Facebook, and on one of my first days, I actually met with Shrep, asked him for some career advice, and I said, I'm kind of interested in maybe being an engineering manager at some point, or a product manager, or I'm not really sure. And he said, well, you need to figure out first like what the differences are between these different roles and figure out what you actually want to do. But he really encouraged me to focus first on becoming a really great software engineer, because if you try splitting your effort between growing in one area and another area at the same time, you really slow down your growth curve. And his model that he uses to think about this is look for a point where you start to plateau in what you're learning, and that might be a good jumping off point to try tackling something new like management. So I stayed at Facebook for a couple years, grew a lot as a software engineer there, and then when I joined Robinhood, I joined as an IC. I did get to explore some management stuff at Facebook. I was able to mentor an intern. I was a bootcamp mentor. So I got some of the foundational teaching in management. So actually when I went to Robinhood, we ended up hiring some interns, and then we ended up growing our iOS engineering team. And we had these new people coming onto the team who needed a mentor. With myself having some of that experience in the past, it was really comfortable for me to start having one-on-ones with these folks and help mentor them as they grew in the company. So I kind of knew from that past experience that management was something I wanted to do. With managers on our team with engineers on our team who are interested in management, that's something that we really try to encourage people to do first. You can try out management in a bite-sized chunk by being a mentor for an intern through a summer. It's a 3-month commitment, and then you have an easy out if you realize you don't like it or you aren't good at it at the end of that summer. So that was a great opportunity for me to try it out and see if this was something I really wanted to do. And then when the opportunity presented itself later in my career, which seems like is the case for all these folks, I jumped at it.
So Shrep is the CTO of Facebook. So we worked together at an 8-person startup, and then we joined Mozilla when it was about 20 people. And he's probably one of the top, easily a top 3 leaders that I've ever worked with. And one of the things listening to Jason talk is if you grow up in open source and in an open source company, you really learn how to manage, because basically you have no control over what most people do, and you have a whole community of people that are contributing. So everyone gets an opinion, everyone gets a vote, and so it's probably trial by fire in a lot of different ways to actually learn how to manage humans, because if you can do that, you can literally manage people in there. But I wanted to talk about the role and the responsibility of a manager, and what you kind of view as your charter within your organizations, and how has that changed with the roles that you've kind of moved in from managing interns to now the position you have now.
So I think it's interesting you choose the kind of word responsibility. So I was thinking about this earlier. I think people often confuse that with sort of activities. So often you do one-on-ones, or you recruit, or you interview. But when I think about management, I really think about a couple categories. First off, there's really the support and development of the team, right? So are people getting clear feedback? Do they know what's expected of them? Is the team composition actually healthy? Do you have the people you need to get what you need to get done? The second category, I think, is really around quality of what you're building. So that's the technical quality or the product quality, with a kind of asterisk, which is quality for the need at the time. So building super long-term extensible systems when really what you need is prototypes is actually not the right thing to do, and same for vice versa. And I think the third thing is really around delivering results and demonstrating impact. So what you are doing important for the business, and do you measure that, and are you sure if what you're doing is the right thing? In terms of how responsibilities evolve, something I've thought about a lot is again that managing at different stages is not so much about the artifacts, doing one-on-ones. It's actually about asking kind of different levels of questions at each stage. So when you're managing an intern, I think the questions are often like, does the intern know what my company does? And are they having a great experience? And are they making friends? You know, it really kind of comes down to that. If you're a line manager, often to me, it's, is the code being produced by your team of high quality? Does every new hire on your new team know what your team's trying to do? Do they know what code reviews, how they should work? And it becomes this very technical, tactical level. When I think of managing managers, it's kind of like, do the managers on your team know how to support their teams well? And are they learning how to kind of like bring in new members of their team, or are they delivering results? And when you get higher and higher up to like a group level or kind of an organizational level, it's like even higher level questions, like are the teams that I have today even the right teams at all? Like should these even exist? Like do we need new teams? Do we need to build new, like combine teams, merge teams? And I think how it's evolved is I think of as you kind of grow as a manager, you don't really shed the responsibilities at the lowest level. So today I manage, you know, almost entirely managers of other managers who have teammates and interns. And so in a given week, I might have that one-on-one with an intern. And earlier today I was like, did you make any friends this summer? Like, are you having a good time at Stripe? And then the next hour it's like, hey, do you need a new team in your group? Because we have 2 here, but I think you're missing something in like infrastructure on this side. So I think what's interesting is the responsibilities kind of like cascade up the bigger your scope gets, which obviously leads to kind of a fun job of just doing a lot of different things in any given day.
So I think, I think that's super insightful. I really like that. I think one thing that is maybe more specific to Teespring than certainly in larger organizations is we have our engineering managers really own business outcomes. So we have almost like a GM structure, except the GM responsibility is kind of shared by the product managers and engineering managers. So they're focused on business units rather than, for example, like areas of the code or infrastructure. Like every team that we have about 30 engineers, and basically everyone is working on a growth project. So everyone has goals. So I find that to be, for this stage of company, kind of the most important thing. I kind of assume that it's like a base level skill for you to know the block and tackle, to know like how the project management works, to be an empathetic human being, to like, you know, get to know your team and the people management and all that. I wouldn't put you in the engineering manager role if it weren't for that. I think the hardest thing for most people at our company, I think, is really thinking about putting the business first and starting every decision that you're making with what does the business need. So at the director level, at least again at our company, that's managing managers, and I think a lot of what you said applies. The VP level at a company like ours, where there's only one VP of engineering, I kind of expected it to be like a super manager job. I was like, okay, now I'm managing like the engineers, all the different engineering managers of the different teams. But the job, I got an executive coach, and one of the first things she said was, your first team now is the executive team, and your second team is the engineering team. And that seemed kind of weird at first, and I wasn't sure I believed it, but it is true. Like, there's not a single day that I don't talk to the CEO. There are many engineers I don't talk to every day. Even engineering, well, I talk to the engineering managers every day, but plenty of engineers I don't talk to every day. So that's like my primary in terms of responsibility. Yeah, like that's the first thing I'm thinking about. So a lot of times we'll be talking about, are we going to do this course of action this way or this way? And my first reaction is like, well, the engineering team's not going to like that. But I go, but the business needs it. So kind of making the engineering team comfortable with the decision is like a tactic that has to be done in order for us to like execute strategically. And then I think being in the CTO role, again, this is very specific to our company. I'm not the CTO that's sort of like an architect. Like a lot of companies have like the CTO who's the, I think Mark Andreessen had like a really good article about this, the difference between VP engineering and CTO. The main difference for me really was just taking over the data and product teams. So I'm actually not, I'm not an architect. There are way better architects at our company than me. So yeah, it was really sort of just to encompass that I was kind of working with more people and kind of managing the director of product on how to like manage the product managers. So yeah, but again, I think that those titles do very different things at different companies.
Yeah, I think both of you did a great job at exploring the breadth of responsibilities that managers have at different levels. I guess the thing I would add is maybe an interesting way of looking at how a manager can evaluate how successful they're being at their job. So obviously, like ultimately, you're responsible for the success of the team, and there are a lot of different ways you do that. But an interesting lens to look at that through is people's happiness. So as like if you're thinking about the work that people are doing, are they feeling satisfied with the work they're doing? Do they feel like they are doing things that are putting them on a career path that they're excited about? Are people happy working with one another? You can kind of apply this happiness lens to any of the things you could be helping out with as a manager, and I think it really focuses in on the people you're working with rather than the organization at a more abstract sense. So I really like that, and that's what I kind of prioritize as my responsibility as a manager.
So when you're at a growing company, there's a ton of opportunities. There's a chance that like companies grow, so you step into interesting positions. So I spend time like mentoring kind of leaders that are up and coming, and part of it is if the organization kind of gets past you, you get layered. And so part of it is like it's kind of the downside of the opportunity. Like it's your responsibility to kind of stay ahead. So how have you guys stayed ahead and kind of continued to grow in scope while? And I know I didn't put this in the question, but like how have you prevented yourself from being layered, or like, have you thought about what that looks like?
I think that's actually a scary thing for anybody who's at a growing company, that it seems like as other people are coming into the organization, as the organization gets bigger, like your relative scope of responsibility shrinks, and I think it's scary to be letting go of responsibility at any point. I guess an interesting thing to consider, I guess, is what's really best for the company and what's best for your own career, and understanding that there will be overlap between the two in a lot of cases is really helpful. But yeah, in terms of scaling with the company, one thing I've tried to do is understand where there are new needs as the team gets bigger. So for example, as our engineering organization has grown and our design organization has grown, we've started to build in product management as part of the team. This is something we didn't exactly know how to do. We didn't actually have anybody on our team who was a product manager in the past. And this was something that we needed to start having people do product management stuff day to day. We initially solved the problem by having some of our product engineers take on the responsibility of product managers. And this was a team that I was managing at the time. So as those product engineers started doing this job, I was working together with them, mentoring them. And as I started working with more product engineers, helping them become successful as product managers, it started to become clear that my responsibilities could grow as well by leading this part of the organization as well. And I think if you are continually solving new problems that arise as a company scales, you will continue to expand the scope of your responsibilities. I think, and so like I think a healthy mindset towards solving the new problems that come as a company grows helps you grow with it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right, kind of optimizing more for learning. And just kind of to react to your question a little bit, I think if you are thinking about how to avoid getting layered, or like the layers are an area of focus, I kind of strongly like consider what are you trying to optimize for, or maybe that says something about the culture of your organization. I do think the focus shouldn't really be on the layers or how many levels you are from kind of a CEO, but much more about what is your scope of impact, how much are you learning. I think that is something both Facebook and Stripe I think have done really well, where there's an emphasis on the scale of every individual engineer and impact continuing to scale as the company grows. So kind of they have this, at both companies, they have this sort of ratio of number of users or dollars or businesses on Stripe to number of engineers. And we work really hard to grow the organization in such a way that scales up. So with every new engineer, you're still having kind of an equal or even bigger impact on our overall user base. And the number of levels is more of an artifact of just like your management team having to grow. I do think obviously at different stages of your career, it can be different. So at Facebook, large organization, was not really thinking about layers or levels and was really focused on what I was doing and growing as an individual leader. Maybe similar to Lee at Stripe, I joined in a very senior role and have actually reported to the CEO for my whole career there. And so it is just a different consideration. I think a lot more about the business, and I'm not thinking that much about like the levels of management and all of that, just because there really isn't anything between me and like what matters to the company.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think at the risk of repeating what you said, my answer was pretty similar. But I think thinking about what the business needs at any given point, as I kind of mentioned, like I think as you move from like IC to engineering manager to director, and up, like one of the biggest differentiating factors is how well you're able to kind of understand and respond to the needs of the business. Whereas like when you're an IC, writing the best code is like the most important thing. And the business kind of works its way in as part of your job. So I think that if you do think about what the business wants and your organization is healthy, that's what's going to get you promoted, right? I think trying to figure out how do I get myself promoted, how do I angle, the answer to that really should simply just be like, do your job, and like hopefully that means you do get promoted. Something that was said previously was think about what worries your manager and solve that problem, and I think that also like helps serve the business.
Our topic is like career promotion and advancement. It's good to think about like the various things. So if people have questions, like I have a ton that I can go through, but I don't want to kind of take up all the air. So there, yeah.
As you grow up the ladder, do you find that it takes more of your own personal energy to continue to develop yourself as opposed to being able to allow mentors within your organization? And if that is the case, how do you find the time to do that? You're also being kind of busy.
So the question was, how do you continue to develop yourself as like your responsibility and your time commitments kind of continue to grow? Fair.
Yeah, so I was really fortunate that I didn't even know to ask. When I moved into the VP role, I was given an executive coach. So that's pretty great. I consider her part of my triumvirate of mental health, my therapist, her, and my stylist. So super important, and I think invaluable. So I don't think mentorship really goes away necessarily. You maybe just kind of need to look for it in different places. Some of my mentors include people that got into engineering management way earlier than me, or who are close friends of mine and they're willing to like donate the time to like meet me for brunch and stuff, or people who are have just done like very impressive things with their management career. Like a friend of mine was the first engineering manager at Square. So yeah, I think finding those mentors, and it doesn't take that much time really. Like just sort of get brunch whenever you have a big problem that you can't figure out. That's kind of been my approach.
I don't have any of those three, so maybe I should get a stylist and or therapist and coach. So I think you're right. Like I do think as the kind of the more senior you get, or the more your role is less like kind of any other role at the company even, or maybe even that your friends are doing, you can get advice, and you should, over brunch, friends, just people in the industry. But it does become a very personalized way of interpreting that advice and how you should apply it to your job. So, I bet Joe and I could have a chat and actually learn a lot about what we're both going through. But I would have to take some time to really sit there and be like, how can I translate what he's seeing at Robinhood to like what I'm seeing at Stripe? So I do think you have to do a lot more of that homework on your own, and it's just, you really do have to just put in that time. But I think mentors come in all forms, and I think the biggest thing to do is, what I've learned a lot about is you can learn something from everyone, regardless of what level they're at. So like a new line manager who joins Stripe, let's say, I often I'm sure I can learn something from them. And so I make a point of just really asking everyone who I know has a different skill set and kind of filing that away. I actually write down notes from typically every kind of one-on-one coffee brunch, just a couple takeaways that are really helpful, and I just review them periodically.
Yeah, I agree with all these things. Something else that we've done at Robinhood is as our team has grown. So at a small startup, you're not going to have a mentor built into that organization who can tell you how to do the job that you're going to have to do next. This is absolutely the case for founders. It's very much the case for anybody who's pretty senior at a relatively early stage startup. So you have to find advisors in some way. We've actually reached out through our VC networks and personal networks to meet with different potential advisors. We actually kind of interviewed several different engineering advisors and found one who really reflected a lot of the values and ideas about how to structure an engineering organization that we had. And brought him on as a formal advisor. So he comes in, meets one-on-one with a few different engineering managers around the company a couple times a month. So that's been really helpful. Another thing is you mentioned finding time or dealing with, as you have more responsibility and more time pressures, finding time to develop yourself. I think you have to also make time for it by cutting out some of your time commitments. And really actively pruning, continuously pruning the things that you spend time on to make time for growth. You have to do that to make time for thinking creatively and changing process that exists that might be broken, but you might just be rolling with because you're not really paying that much attention to it. You need space to do those kinds of transcendental changes. So yeah, got to make time.
How did you make your last career decision? So what were the considerations? How did you weigh role versus company versus financial outcome? And so I don't know if you guys are the spreadsheet matrix, stack ranked everything, or if it was more of a gut feel.
I went from Facebook to a very early stage startup. I wanted to take on a lot of responsibility. I wanted to build something from the ground up. I wanted to learn a ton. I was really interested in starting a company at some point. It just made sense to join an early stage startup. I joined one a little haphazardly. I had a friend who was starting the company, and I really believed that this group of people could be really successful. I believed in the product. But it's not. I don't think there's an art to it. I joined something that I thought I could be successful at, and I thought I could grow with. Maybe that's the bigger thing. I felt very confident in my ability to build great products. Not confident at all in anything around management or leadership necessarily, but it was an opportunity for me to grow into that as the company grew. So hopefully you find an opportunity where your team will be growing and you can grow too.
Yeah, I think it's definitely very personal depending on your life stage. So for example, some people at a certain time in their career, compensation may be the highest order. Maybe they were trying to save up for their family, there's something going on in their life. So for me personally, the last decision I made from Facebook to Stripe, there are a couple things that went into it. I would say for some of the basics, like compensation, I would never tell anyone it doesn't matter. I think for compensation, for me, the primary thing was fairness. So in the end, I just want to make sure you're fairly compensated for the work you're doing and the role you're being hired into. So that's kind of a checkbox, you gotta have at least that. So that's how I considered compensation. On top of that, it was for me much more around learning and role, impact at company, and actually new space. So for me, I spent a long time working in social products. I had seen the 800 employee to 10,000 employee stage. It was in the South Bay. I had already been managing for years. So I wanted to find something that was definitionally smaller than that. So Stripe was about 200 employees, about 80 engineers. I wanted to join as a manager where I could take the things I had learned, but actually translate them to a new culture. And I wanted to learn a new space. So I went from social product to developer products, payments, business, kind of enterprise entrepreneurial products. And for me, Stripe actually was a really unique choice because I felt like it kind of hit all of the stage and kind of growth phase and a lot of the culture and mission, but it also was like a combination of like 3 new industries at once. So it's everything, it's developer, payments, enterprise, business. So I really was trying to maximize learning and be very fairly compensated, I would say.
So yeah, I actually did and have done, I think pretty much always with my career decisions, the cheesy little matrix and what do you care about and how do you, but then I think usually after that, then I throw it away, but it's kind of one of those things where it's like the planning is the important part and the outcome is maybe not. And I also talk all my friends' ears off to like no end until they're sick of it. But I think actually the very last thing I did before I decided to go to Teespring was I actually got hold of the investors. Which someone gave me that advice and I was like, that's crazy, why would you do that? But now I definitely strongly recommend that if you feel like, I mean, yeah, obviously like it kind of depends on the company, right? If you're joining Uber as an engineering manager, I don't know that you'll be able to get like their board on the phone, but for multiple reasons, I guess. So I talked to 2 of the investors who are on the board, who I was able to get a hold of like through my network. And then what they said was, I mean, you have to understand that they're going to obviously try to sell you on the company, but just hearing their thinking.
Questions?
Could you share like the good ways in your work is how do you manage the time and how do you manage the energy to always be positive and motivated?
Question is, how do you manage your time and energy?
Yeah, that is part of your job. So like definitely when you show up to work and you've had a bad morning or like there's a hurricane that's 5 days away from hitting your hometown, you just kind of have to smile. Like, I don't know, yeah, I think that part is really hard. And I do think it's part of, there's an interesting balance. I think you talked about authenticity. I think that, being vulnerable with your team when things are like personally affecting you, you can do that at the same time as trying to sort of like motivate. Especially if the things that are affecting you are sort of like about the company or like problems you're facing job-wise. I don't really want that to leak. In terms of my emotional state, I'll definitely talk about like the substance of like this problem I'm facing, right? And even with my direct reports, but yeah, just kind of have to stay positive always.
Yeah, I agree. I think I often tell like new managers, like mood management is actually one of the hardest parts of the transition. The way I describe it is, I feel like as an engineer, an IC engineer, you're kind of doing this local hill climbing mood where you're like solving a problem, you finish your task, you finish it up, and then you kind of start over, and it's just kind of this continuous uphill. And I think with management, it's just like a wild swing of emotion. Like the lows are very low and the highs are very high. And I just think it takes time to kind of get used to how to like manage your own wild mood swings. And for me, it took a while, and I don't think you ever fully like kind of master that. But there are certain ways that you kind of learn to present at least a more even kind of mood to your team. In terms of managing time, I think a thing that you said this, I think, making time. I asked someone really recently who's actually kind of a very senior VP of engineering at Google, been managing huge teams for years and years, and he was like, the biggest thing people make the mistake of doing, the more senior they get, is they just book up their entire schedule. Like every half hour is like a one-on-one or a meeting or a strategy meeting or a discussion. And the best thing you can do is just literally give yourself chunks of multiple hours of free time. And I think if you can swing it, I really think blocking off a couple like 2-3 hour chunks a week for yourself and just putting it on your calendar, do not schedule, you will find a good way to use that time, and it's going to really help you clear your mind and figure out what you need to do. That's not just jumping from like task to task, fire to fire. I also find that to be very cyclical though. So maybe every quarter I add my 2 or 3 hour chunks, and a month or two later they're all gone, and then I have to add them back again, and then they disappear. But I really keep at it, and I think that's been a really good tip for me.
Yeah, and in terms of managing your energy, I think it's really important to become very aware of how your energy fluctuates when you do different things. One thing that I learned for myself is I did this exact thing. I booked up my calendar as full as possible, and I was constantly interviewing people, constantly having one-on-ones, having meetings with different teams, and I realized that on days where I had more than like I don't know, 8 meetings, I would just feel totally drained. And I would come to work the next day at like a lower baseline than the day before. So doing that on a continual basis was really like destructive for me. I think recognizing that you have some certain kinds of limits. There are certain things that make you feel more energized and certain things that really drain you. Helps you be very intentional about how you budget your time, what things you allow yourself to do, and that's helped me manage my energy a lot better.
How did your work-life balance change as you get out from engineering to VP of engineering? Did you see any change in your work-life balance?
The question was on changes in work-life balance as the roles became more senior.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you enter a new role, I think even moving into engineering management, especially moving into VP of engineering, it's not going to be a 40-hour job like at a startup. I wouldn't lie about that. I think like if it's a brand new skill set and you kind of need to get to your 10,000 hours and you kind of need to get there as fast as possible. So unpopular opinion, but it's kind of my experience.
I think there's a lot to that, just like putting in time especially when you're learning a new skill. I do think the difference, maybe to talk a little about like engineer or to kind of managing a team, manager of a group, and so forth. I think as an engineer, there are more things that are kind of by the clock, like you're on call or you have to get this certain thing done by a certain time. And the deadlines are more concrete and like daily or weekly. But I think there's more redundancy for you as an individual. So you might be on call, but next week someone else is on call and they can do exactly what you're doing. The more senior you get, I actually think you have more variance in the time that you control. Like if I don't finish something today, I know I can do it tomorrow, or I can even do it next month, or sometimes next quarter, and it's fine. But there are things that only I can do. And so I know, like, if I don't do this thing this quarter, I have to do it next quarter, or I have to do it the quarter after. So I think that it can just really change how you choose to manage your work in life, right? So you can go the other route where I just do everything for next quarter, this quarter, and I'm constantly working, or I can choose to expand that out a little bit more. So I think for me, it's also been very cyclical. So at the start of a new role, I probably work a ton more, and then it kind of stabilizes and sort of goes like this.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think for me, it's mostly a matter of understanding how I can balance my time, what the things I need to be putting more time into or front loading, so that I don't get to a point where I realize, oh no, I have no time left, but I actually have a ton of things that are fully dependent on me doing this by tomorrow. So when you're taking on new responsibilities, you don't have great intuition about what things are going to take more time or what things you need to do first. And I think that's where you end up having to play catch up a lot more. And I think if you're spending way more than I don't know, whatever you're comfortable with, maybe 40, 60, whatever, 100 hours a week, you're probably doing something wrong. So you probably shouldn't be doing some of the things you're doing, or you probably should be prioritizing them differently. And it's hard to know how to do that successfully if you're not really familiar with the role.
So I think I got my first VP position at Mozilla. I was probably like just turned 30 or early 30s, and then found that the biggest change for me came when we had kids. So I had 2 toddlers, and so before you have children, time is fundamentally infinite. Like you want to work till 1 in the morning, like you work till 1 in the morning. It all changes when you want to be home by like dinner or bedtime, and so the biggest trick there was actually you got to learn what you let burn, and let it become like this ruthless prioritization of like, this is the list of things that will get done, and this list I have decided that it will not get done. And so making sure that's kind of the important, like, it gets done. And so it really focuses, you realize that like time is not infinite, and you have to kind of learn to balance. And so as you start to learn, like having to manage or help develop the lives of not just the people that work for you, but like the people that live in your house, and learning how to make those sacrifices. And so you have to learn how to work like smarter and more effectively, because it just like you can't let hours no longer become infinite. I'll do the last question. I'm sorry. I'm sure people have a lot of questions, but we've got to wrap it up. Who's been, or like what experience, book, person has been the biggest influence on you as a manager, and then a last recommendation for people as they kind of continue on kind of developing their careers?
So I actually think one of my biggest influences as on me as a manager has been one of my past managers in the past. I think as I started becoming an engineering manager and then taking on more responsibilities as a manager, I looked to what this person had done in the past, how they helped me grow as an engineer. I've looked back on some of the senior leaders at Facebook, like Chris Cox. I asked myself, like, okay, how did Chris Cox help facilitate a really tremendous product organization at the end of the day? How was he involved in the team? How did he structure process around this thing? Are there pieces I can pick from this? I think you can read about this stuff, you can talk to advisors, but the experiences that you've had as an individual will stick with you a lot better, and you can hopefully pick and choose some great things from that. So yeah, and piece of advice there, probably have a lot that I would want to share with myself if I could look back, but yeah, maybe we'll come back to that.
Actually, a very similar answer. When I think about, I actually can't cite, a single influence or a book. I actually don't learn super well from books in general. I've read a decent number of management books, but I personally just they kind of go in and, until I apply something, they don't really stick. So I will say I've actually had a lot of managers. I had 9 managers in 6 years at Facebook, and I've had 1 at Stripe, and I've learned something from every single one of them. So I really do think every manager you have or encounter will teach you something, but the biggest way I've learned is trying and making a lot of mistakes. I learned the best from doing, and I think there is something to the 10,000 hours to just like seeing so many versions of the same situations, and that really builds kind of the comfort and confidence in it. In terms of advice, I almost want to buy more time like you. So one thing I learned, probably not too late, but later than I wish I had. So it's something around kind of, you're talking about your family and finding, eventually you like realize like, you don't have all the time in the world. I think the biggest realization is that's true regardless of external pressures. Like you do make your own life and choose how you spend your time. And the biggest advice I'd give is like, you don't need people to be pulling on your time to force you to prioritize. You just kind of look at your own time and say, what is worth me doing right now? And really be disciplined about how you spend your time. Like take some time, like step out of yourself and kind of look at your schedule, look at your week, look at your month. And I think 2 concrete tips that have worked well for me are you shared the time blocking one, just like actually do the calendar sweep every month. Look at how you spend every day. The other one is you can change the interval however you like, but I roughly spend a week a year thinking about the past year and the next year. And I think that's been a huge way for me to just actually get enough out of work to like really introspect and think about just how I spend my time and what I want to do next.
Yeah, so I think actually with the managers we promoted from within, I've had them read 2 books. So one is High Output Management, which I think is by Andy Grove, which you look at it and you're like, this book must be outdated because there's this like dorky guy on the front and it's about like making silicon at Intel. But it's actually really good at kind of the block and tackle of just like, what is a one-on-one for? Why should you do it? What should you do in the one-on-one? Like, I think it's really good at covering all of those mechanics. And then the other one is, and I think this is again specific to being a kind of startup like ours, is Hard Thing About Hard Things, which is actually a book mainly about how to be a CEO, but I think it very much applies to being an engineering manager in terms of taking ownership and being prepared for these ups and downs. Like I think yeah, I think one reality is just that when you have so many people on your team, the likelihood that one of them is going to have a problem that is just like a terrible problem every day starts to get high, right? Like most of your team might be happy, but there's like one person every day or like one problem every day. So the higher up in management you get, the more stuff that's getting escalated to you, and your life starts to become more and more just like garbage. So being able to deal with that and keep a smile on your face, as I said, right? Like, because I do think that's the value you're providing. Like that's kind of how I get through it. I'm like, hey, someone's got to do this job. Someone has to handle the complaint of like, oh, this person's looking at me funny, and it's like, yeah, I'm doing that. So anyway, and then in terms of advice to myself, I think, so mentors. Yeah, so I've also had a bunch of managers over the years, and they have ranged quite a bit. So from the people at Pivotal who are like, I learned a lot about agile development and sort of like dogma and practices. That was a bad word, but like, just building the tools for development, and also just like being very, very focused on the happiness and retention of employees, all the way to like, I don't think I've found it yet, but I'm kind of trying to feel it out. I think, maybe that kind of relates to the advice to myself, which would have been coming out of Pivotal and going into my own startup and trying to sort of transport the way Pivotal did software development had a lot of positives, but definitely some negatives. And it's not specific to Pivotal, that's specific to the idea of just like every company is very context dependent, like what works here might not work there. So I think just keeping an open mind and being able to try something and be cool with like, if that failed, I'll fix it.
So thank you, audience. I know it's getting late, so I really appreciate your time, and thank you, panel. You guys are great.